Hello and welcome to another video here at the NHL Hockey channel. Today I will be predicting the 22-23 NHL standings. As with the regular season fast approaching, I want to just relay my opinion on where I think all 32 teams will end up finishing the year. And that's all coming up right now. Hello and welcome to another video here. So with the regular season officially starting on Tuesday next week, and the unofficial start tomorrow as the Sharks and Preds play back-to-back games over in Europe as part of the Global Series. And with that, I really just wanted to tell you all what I think will happen for this upcoming season. I really do think that some of my predictions may be right, but most of them will probably be wrong. But it's just, I really do like to try and predict these things. I'll be going division by division, starting in the Metro, going to the Atlantic, then to the Central, and finishing off with the Pacific, and going 8th through 1st in my predictions on who I think will be finishing in those places. So from 8th to 1st in the Metro, and so on and so forth. And just let me know what you think in the comments, if my placements are right, if you would move someone higher or lower, and if you have your predictions, I would love to hear. So let me know down in the comments. But to start with, I'm going to start off in the Metro Division, a really competitive division, and I think it got a lot more competitive this offseason, as I think the bottom 4 teams from last year really improved, and some of those top-end teams from the Metro did downgrade a bit. But to start with, I predict will finish 8th in the Metro Division this year, and that is going to be the Philadelphia Flyers. Now, the Flyers didn't do enough, in my opinion, to be a good team this year. I expect them to be one of the worst teams in the NHL this year, probably a bottom 5, bottom 10 team. I think that their injury concerns with Ellis, Couturier, Farabee, and Brink to start the year will really hurt them, especially with the fact that Ellis and Couturier possibly could be out for the entire season. That's a really big blow to them. They didn't really do enough, in my opinion, to add and replace those guys. They did get defensemen like Tony DeAngelo and Justin Braun, who I think should stabilize the defense a bit. And they did get hard-hitting forward Nicolas Deslauriers, who should be a good fourth-line forward, but I think they've lost too many offensive weapons, and they will not be able to be a competitive team this year, night in, night out. And with the opportunity to possibly get Johnny Gaudreau, as he wanted to go there, but they weren't able to move enough cap out, I just think that the Flyers' aggressive retool never happened, and I think that after this year they could start a rebuild. In 7th place, I have the Washington Capitals. Now, this may come as a surprise to some, as the Capitals finished 4th last year and were well in a playoff spot. But I think that their aging core and injuries are going to play a big role in their downfall this year. Most of the Capitals core is in their mid-30s right now, with guys like Shkin, Backstrom, Kuznetsov, Oshie. All of these guys are in their mid-30s and are starting to decline a bit over the past few years. I think the injuries to Backstrom and Wilson will play a huge role, as those are 2 key members of their top 6. I do think they replaced them with as best of the players as you could in Strome and Brown, but I still think they'll miss those guys. I know Wilson should be back around Christmas time, but they'll definitely miss those. I do think that their goaltending situation is a bit more cloudy, and I think a tandem of Samsonov and Vanacek would probably be better than a starter of Kemper and a backup of Lindgren. And they have a lot of players entering the final year of their deals, so even if they make the playoffs, they could have a lot of change after this offseason, and I think that they'll either do a retool or rebuild following this year, but I don't see them making the playoffs, and I could see them be a bottom 10 team this year. In 6th place, I have the New Jersey Devils. Now, I think the Devils will definitely be a better team than last year. I think they'll put up a lot more points than they did in the previous season. They did some fantastic work improving this team, in my opinion, adding guys like Andre Palat, a goalie in Vitek Vanacek will push Blackwood to be a better goalie this year. I also think that the Marino addition really solidifies their top 4 defense, and I really do like all of this by the Devils, but in my opinion, they're a team who's still trying to come out of a rebuild, and I think that one more year and they should be a playoff contender, but I think they'll fall just short this year, and I think they'll be really close, but I don't like the Devils' odds to make the playoffs this year. In fifth place, they have the Islanders. Now, the Islanders barely did anything this year. I mean, they got Romanov, which I think is a great addition, will really help improve their defense, and I think they could be a lot more like the team who went to the Eastern Conference Final 3 and 2 years ago. But they didn't really do anything to that forward group, which I think was the glaring issue they had. They needed more offense, especially a partner for Matthew Barzal, and they didn't do it. So they will definitely be competitive, and they'll be in it to the last. But when it cuts down to playoff time, I don't think they will make it. I think they finish a hair out, probably a good maybe handful of points out, but not too much. And I think the Islanders will definitely be better than they were last year. There's a lot of good teams in that Metro Division this year, and with no improvement to their forward group, I can't see them making the playoffs right now. Over to fourth place in the Metro, where I have the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, the Penguins surprised me a lot by being able to keep most of their core players like Letang and Rust and Malkin, who are all pending UFAs this year. And that really surprised me, and I think they really did good. They also were able to keep guys like Rickard Rakell. They re-signed Kasperi Kapanen. They brought back Casey DeSmith. So they've done a lot of good things. But I think their major improvement has been on the blue line, where they added guys like Jeff Petrie, Ty Smith, Jan Ruta, and they got rid of a couple players like Mike Matheson and John Marino. I think this defense will be a lot better than last year. I think that they won't finish too far away from last year's point total. Maybe a little bit worse because of how tight this division will be this year. But I do have them making a wild card spot. I think they should have enough firepower this year to contend for a playoff spot. I definitely see them making the playoffs. I could see them make a top 3 spot, but in my opinion, a wild card spot will be probably more likely for the Penguins. In third spot, I know this may come as a surprise to some people, but I have the Columbus Blue Jackets finishing in third in the Metro. Now, the Jackets did a lot of good things this offseason, in my opinion. They were able to acquire Johnny Gaudreau via free agency. That was a move I really did like. I know they had to move Bjorkstrand to make that work, but I think Gaudreau is a much better player than Bjorkstrand is. They had to pay a hefty price, in my opinion, to bring in Eric Gudbranson. I don't really like the contract, but for what Gudbranson brings, it's a good third-pair addition for the Jackets, and I think it's another thing that this team needed. They still have good goaltending. They're going to have a few young players. I think Sillinger will take strides this year. Having a duo of Gaudreau and Laine is going to be huge for this team. Kent Johnson's going to be a fun young rookie to watch. This defense should play a lot better. I think Merzlikins is ready to solidify himself as a starter in the NHL, and I think this Jackets team will finish third. I really do think, I know I might be a little bit more optimistic than most on the Jackets, making such an improvement from last year, but I do think the Jackets should be able to make the playoffs again. I'm not sure if this will be able to win around in this year's playoffs, but I do see an opportunity for them to make the playoffs, and I know that might come as a surprise to some, but I definitely think that the Jackets are well positioned to make a run in the Metro Division. And then the top 2 teams are going to be the top 2 teams as last year. And in second place, I have the same second place team as last year, and that is the New York Rangers. The Rangers were able to basically be close to what they were last year pre-deadline. I know they lost a lot of their deadline acquisitions, which really fit in well. But if you look at this team on paper to their pre-deadline team on paper, it's really quite similar. I think the addition of Trocheck should help the Rangers be a better face-off team. I think that he should be able to put up points, probably more to a degree than Strome did with the Rangers. I think that their bottom 6 looks good. I like that Kravtsov should make their team this year, a top 9 forward who should really be a good piece to that puzzle. Their defense looks pretty similar to last year. Most of the players that were there last year on the defense are there again this year, and I think their defense should definitely be really good again. And on the goaltending side, Shesterkin is, in my opinion, the best goalie in the world right now. So he should once again be helpful to this Rangers team to carry them back to the playoffs. I don't think the Rangers are at too much of a risk. I think that they'll have this around the same amount of points as last year, but once again, I think they'll finish second. They should have a home playoff day, in my opinion, and I think that their offense will be lethal again this year. And when you have a defense backed up by Igor Shesterkin, you can't really go wrong there. And who I see winning the Metro Division this year is the same team who won the Metro Division last year, and that is the Carolina Hurricanes. Now, the Hurricanes, I think, were able to keep most of their team together and did a really good job. They did lose guys like Trocheck and Niederreiter and Tony DeAngelo in the offseason, but they were able to bring in Brent Burns, who I think will be a really good addition to that blue line. Dylan Coughlin, who I think will be a very sneaky good pickup for the Carolina Hurricanes, and I think he could carve himself out a role on the third pair. They also got a few offensive additions like Paul Stastny, Andre Kasha. I know they acquired Max Pacioretty for him to play and be a productive forward, so the injury to him really does hurt them. But he will be their own deadline acquisition once he gets back, because he should be back around February, and he should help improve that Carolina offense a lot more. And quite honestly, I don't see any other team really contending with the Canes for the Metro Division. I think the Rangers probably stand the best chance to upend the Hurricanes for the top of the division, but all in all, I can't see anyone passing the Canes and finishing ahead of them. So here's my point total for the Metro Division. I think that the Canes, the Rangers, the Jackets, the Penguins should all make the playoffs this year. And I think that this will be a highly competitive division. Some teams will barely miss out, but I think that this will be a really good year for the Metro Division, and a lot should be in the mix for a playoff spot. Now let's jump over to the Atlantic, where I have finishing last in that division, the Montreal Canadiens. I think that the Canadiens are still in the midst of a rebuild, and I don't really see them making much noise this year in the regular season. I think the loss of Price due to injury was really hard on them. I think their defense is going to be good and exciting, but young and inexperienced, as they traded Petrie and Romanov this offseason, who I think were two really big pieces of this blue line. And with those two gone, they will probably have to rely a lot more on their younger blue line players, like maybe Harris or Baron. But I do think that in a couple of years' time, this defense will be good. But there should be some growing pains this year. They have a pretty decent forward group, and I think they could outscore a lot of teams. I think one thing about the Canadiens is they could surprise a lot of people with their goal-scoring ability. I know they have good young players like Suzuki and Caulfield, but I like the additions they've made with Monahan and Dodonov. But when it comes to playoffs, I think they're far away from the playoffs right now. I don't think they could contend with any of the top 5-6 teams in the Atlantic this year, and I would say will probably be closer to getting a high spot in the entry draft to possibly get Connor Bedard, more likely than making a playoff spot. So I don't see the Montreal Canadiens doing much this year. Now over to 7th in the Atlantic, and I have the Buffalo Sabres. Now the Sabres didn't do too much this offseason, and I think that was their best moves. They were able to switch in a few veterans, like they lost Miller, but they brought in Ilya Lyubushkin. They lost a guy like Cody Eakin, but brought in a guy like Riley Sheahan. They retained guys like Vinny Hinostroza, Craig Anderson. They brought in Eric Comrie on the goaltending. All moves I really, really like. But I think the plan this year for the Sabres is to get some more young players into this lineup. I think 3 guys in particular, Jack Quinn, Owen Power, and John Jason Peterka, are all going to be key pieces for this Buffalo Sabres team. And I think with these young guys, and all the guys who did a lot better than I think I would have expected last year, I think they make another stride this year. I think they're close to the 82-point mark, maybe a bit lower, but they should be a lot closer to 500 than they have been in previous years. But I still see them being a bottom 10 team. I think that they will take some strides this year and be a lot better, But when it comes to playoffs, I think there's still a lot of better teams in front of them. If they have a good offseason next year, maybe they start getting themselves into the conversation that maybe they could be a playoff team, but I think they'd have to do a pretty good job next offseason. I still see them being a seller at the deadline and a bottom 10 team this year. Over in 6, we have a team who heavily improved this year and I think should be a lot more productive, and that is the Detroit Red Wings. Now, the Red Wings were able to make a lot of good additions this year. They were able to bring in Olimata, Ben Sherratt, Ville Husso, and then 3 forwards in Dominic Kubalik, David Perron, and Andrew Kopp. 6 really, really good additions, and I think that this made the Detroit Red Wings a ton deeper. I still think they, just like the Devils, a lot of good additions, and will be a lot more competitive than last year, but they're still a year away from being a playoff contender. I think they will get closer, just like the Devils, but for the Red Wings, I think once again, they did a lot of good things last year in the first half of the season, but fell apart in the second. I think they should be a lot more consistent, but once again, just miss out on a playoff spot this year. Over to 5th in the Atlantic, and I have the Boston Bruins finishing there. I think that the Bruins didn't do too much, but they've had this core for a long time, and I don't think they really need to tinker with it. They brought in David Krejci after his year over in Europe. They swapped forwards with the Devils by getting Pavel Zacha for Eric Haula, and that was basically the extent of their off-season additions. But I do think that their goaltending should be once again really good with Ullmark and Swayman. I think their offense should be pretty decent this year, even without Marchand for the first little while. But their injuries on the blue line really do concern me. You have guys like McAvoy and Grzelcyk both being out for the first few months of the year, and I think that will really hurt the Bruins. Now, I think they could probably keep a 500 pace, maybe a bit below for that, but after a okay start, I don't think they will be able to keep up with any of the wildcard teams or playoff teams this year. I think it's quite easy to say that they will be one of the closest teams to a playoff spot who miss. I only see them missing by a fraction. I think that the Bruins will be a really close team to a playoff spot, but I think this is the year that Boston ends up regressing a bit. I do think that they will finish out of a playoff spot, and with all of their older core, I could see them start a rebuild after this year. They do have a lot of good young pieces, like John Beecher and Fabian Lysell, but I just think that this is the year where the Bruins finally miss the playoffs. In 4th place, I have a team who really improved this year, and I think improved enough to make it back to the playoffs, and that is the Ottawa Senators. The Sens did a lot of good moves. They were able to bring in Cam Talbot. They were able to bring in Claude Giroux. They were able to bring in Alex DeBrincat. Also Tyler Mott, who's a good depth addition. And they did lose a few players, but Chris Tierney, Michael Del Zotto, a lot of those guys, Colin White, a lot of these guys who were depth pieces on their team, they were able to move the Matt Murray contract, which I think was a huge win for them. And I think they have enough pieces here that if they can get a better start than the Bruins in the first 20 games when the Bruins are missing Marchand and McAvoy, they should be able to keep ahead of the Bruins, and I think should be able to make the playoffs. I don't see them making a top 3 spot. I can't see them knocking off the Florida teams or Toronto. I do see them making it in a wildcard spot. I do think they should be able to push forward and definitely be a good team this year. I do think they should score a lot of goals and get a lot more saves than before. Over in 3rd place, I have the Florida Panthers, who I am a bit concerned about. The Panthers were able to acquire Matthew Tkachuk, a few probably underrated pickups in guys like Nick Cousins and Colin White, and I think their offense should be potent again this year. They did lose Huberdeau, but I think Tkachuk and Huberdeau should be 1-for-1. I think they're both pretty similar players, but they did lose guys like Mason Marchment, trade deadline acquisition Claude Giroux. Anthony Duclair is going to be injured until December-ish, so it's going to be really difficult for them to be the offensive powerhouse they were last year. And I'm even more concerned about their defense. after they moved Mackenzie Weegar and Ben Sherratt left via free agency, that defense is pretty bare when it comes to depth. So I definitely think that the defense could be a huge factor for the Panthers. I don't see the Panthers being too much worse than they were last year, but I do think they fall a few slots down into third in the Atlantic. And I think that they really do need to make some sort of addition to their blue line in season to try and help this team get back to being a Stanley Cup contender. Over in second place in the Atlantic, I have the Tampa Bay Lightning. Now I think the Lightning should finish around the same spot as they did last year. The Bolts did really good in the offseason. They did lose a couple key pieces like Andre Palat and Ryan McDonough, but I think they replaced them with a couple of good players in like Ian Cole and Hayden Fleury on the blue line, and up front Vladislav Nemesnikov. And I think they should be a pretty good team. They've made the Cup final the last 3 years, so this is a team who knows how to win. I don't see much of a drop-off last year. I do think the loss of Palat and McDonough might cost them a few wins, but I don't think they should be too worried. And I do see them keeping a top 3 spot and having a home playoff date next year. And I have first in the Atlantic being this Toronto team who just can't seem to get out of the first round. They've been in the playoffs the last 6 years, 6 consecutive seasons, but have not been able to miss the first round. But I do think this could be the year. I know a lot of people have been wary and a little bit concerned about their goaltending additions by moving on from Campbell, Mrazek, and bringing in Samsonov and Murray. But in my opinion, if Murray can stay healthy and Samsonov can be a little bit better than last year and prove he's a starter, I think this duo could actually do quite well. I am a little bit worried. I think this is a little bit of a risk because Murray does have a huge injury history, and that's sort of the same thing that when they brought in Peter Mrazek, he had injury history, but he was an okay goalie. But I think if Murray can play suitable as backup and stay healthy, and Samsonov can be a good starter, this team should be able to do really good this year. And I do like the additions of like Calle Yarncroke and keeping Mark Giordano, bringing in Nicholas Obukibel to replace guys who left like Ilya Mikheyev and Jason Spezza. But I do think this Maple Leafs team is lethal. I think they'll have a really good offense. I think their defense will be adequate enough. And I think that this Maple Leafs team should definitely win the Atlantic Division. So once again, here are my points predictions for the Atlantic Division. I do think these teams will be really competitive again this year, but I don't see too much disparity as we saw last year. I think the gap between top and bottom of this division is going to close dramatically, and I do see a flip-flop in who's making the playoffs. So that's all for the Eastern Conference. Now we head over to the West, and we'll start in the Central Division, where I have 8th in the Central Division being the Chicago Blackhawks. I don't think this comes as much surprise. The Blackhawks, following in the footsteps of teams like Arizona and Buffalo, have sold off a lot of players this year. They moved on from Kubalik and Strome. They traded guys like DeBrincat and Doc. Their goaltending this year is a lot worse with Stalock and Mrazek than it was last year with Fleury and Lankinen. I think their defense is probably their best position, and they should do good, but I have a hard time finding them scoring some offense. They do have a powerhouse forward like Kane, and a couple of good players like Taze, Anthony and Domi, but all of these players are in the last year of their deals and could all be trade deadline chips. In that case, the Blackhawks could have basically no top 6 forwards post-deadline. So I really do think this Blackhawks team will be tanking for Connor Bedard. I do see them finishing last in the NHL this year, and I think this will be a tough year for Blackhawks fans as they start year 1 of this probably 3 to 5 year rebuild. Over to 7th in the Central Division, and I have maybe a surprise team for some, the Winnipeg Jets finishing there. I don't like that the Jets did not make too many moves this offseason. They lost guys like Paul Stastny. They lost Andrew Kopp at last year's deadline. They moved on from Eric Comrie to bring in David Rittich, who I don't think is too much of a improvement on the backup role for the Jets. I also think that this team is going through a lot of problems in the locker room. Obviously, they stripped Blake Wheeler of captaincy earlier this offseason, so I think there's a lot of problems for the Jets. I would say that they're probably more likely to be a bottom 10 team and start some sort of a rebuild, because we've already had speculations that guys like Wheeler, Scheifele, Dubois could be moved, and maybe even guys like DeMello and Dillon. So I think the Jets could end up being one of the bottom dwellers of the league this year, and I do see them being 7th. I know a lot of people will probably have them contending for a playoff spot. I don't see that. Over in 6th in the Central, I have the Arizona Coyotes. I think the Coyotes are going to do a fantastic job this year. They were able to once again use their cap space to their advantage, acquiring guys like Patrick Nemeth and Zach Kassian, who were cap dumps, while getting a lot more draft capital. They were also able to acquire a few good depth pieces like Stetcher and Bukestad in free agency, and I think their young guys like Jack McBain, Victor Soderstrom, and Dylan Guenther should all take some steps this year to solidify themselves as NHL players. I think Soderstrom should be able to nail down a top 4 role this year, and McBain and Guenther should both be top 6 forwards. And I think Guenther could end up playing with a guy like Clayton Keller and putting up a lot of points this year. I don't think they'll make the playoffs. I think they'll still be far away from that. But I wouldn't be surprised if they surprised a few people and were a lot more competitive than expected. Over in 5th in the Central, I have the Nashville Predators. I think that the Preds did some really good moves this offseason, bringing in guys like Nino Niederreiter and Ryan McDonough. I think that their goaltending is pretty solid with UC Saros. I just don't know if it's enough to catapult them back into the playoffs this year. I think there's a lot of teams that improved this year, especially in the Pacific Division, who missed last year, and I'm not really sure if they can be a playoff team. For me, they're not. I think they're going to be really close. They're going to miss by a few points, but I don't see them making the playoffs this year. Over in 4th in the Central Division, I have the Minnesota Wild. The Wild were 2nd in the Central last year and were a pretty good offensive powerhouse. But due to their cap penalties from the Suter and Parise buyouts, they had to move off a lot of good pieces this year. They had to trade away Cam Talbot. They had to trade away Dmitry Kulyakov. And most importantly, they had to trade away Kevin Fiala, who was a huge piece of their offense last year. So I think that with these 3 guys gone, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. They still have a lot of good young players. I think Addison actually makes that defense better. Rossi should help on the offensive side. And Gustafsson, who they acquired from Ottawa in the Talbot trade, should be a decent backup. I just think that the Wild probably downgraded a bit this year. I wouldn't say too much. I see them making the playoffs, but I see them making the playoffs as a wild card team. So going from 2nd to a wildcard team is a bit of a drop, and I think it's reasonable to say with all of the moves they've had to make this offseason, but that's where I do see them finishing. Now to 3rd in the Central, where I have the St. Louis Blues. Now the Blues were able to be pretty good this year in the offseason. They had to move Ville Husso because of their tight cap, and they weren't able to bring back David Perron. But they were able to re-sign Nikolai, who I think was a good fit in St. Louis after being acquired at the deadline. They brought in Thomas Greiss, who I think can be a capable backup for the Blues, as long as Binnington can play good as a starter. But I do think that the Blues will probably finish close to what they did last year, but maybe a bit worse. I think Perron was a really good player for them. They have a few injuries on the blue line with Scandella and Peronovich to start the year, which I think will hurt them a bit. And Grace is a worse backup, I think, than Husso was. But I do like that the Blues are still a good team. Neighbors and Costin are 2 forwards, young forwards, who I could see making the roster this year. And I think the Blues still have enough pieces to be a top 3 team in the Central. I just think they'll fall off a bit. Over to 2nd in the Central, where I have the Dallas Stars finishing. The Stars, I think, were able to improve in my eyes. The Stars kept their goaltending tandem from late last year with Ottinger and Wedgwood. Ottinger should be an elite starter for the Dallas Stars, while Wedgwood should be a decent backup. They did lose John Klingberg, which I think was their major subtraction from this year. but they went out and got Colin Miller in free agency and recently acquired Nils Lundqvist via trade. I think these two additions should help the Stars be a lot more competitive this year, but on top of that, they should also be a lot deeper than they were last year on the blue line, and they also added Mason Marchment in the forward group, who I think will excel with the Stars in a middle six role and definitely help the Stars team be a lot more offensive, which I think was their problem last year. They weren't as offensive as some of the other teams, and they have a couple of young players like Wyatt Johnston and Ty Dellandrea, who could make a run at a roster spot this year, and I think could also help this offense. So for the Stars, I think that second is not that far off. I could see them finishing maybe third, maybe flip-flopping with St. Louis, but I do think they've made enough additions that they could just make it as second in the Central and have a home playoff date. As for first in the Central, I don't think this comes as any surprise. It's the defending Stanley Cup champions, the Colorado Avalanche. The Avalanche, due to cap problems, the Avalanche didn't retain probably as much of their Stanley Cup winning roster as they would have liked to. Nazem Kadri and Andrei Burakovsky, who were two pretty good top six players, are no longer with the team. But they were able to keep that defense from last year basically intact. They did lose Kemper, but they got Georgiev, who I think could be a good goalie for the Avalanche this year. I think Georgiev and Francois will make a good tandem. And who I think Newhook should take strides this year to be a good second line center for the Avalanche, and I also think that the Evan Rodriguez addition should help offset the loss of Andrei Burakovsky. So I think this team is pretty similar to what they were last year, and I don't really see much drop off. They should win the Central. I also have them winning the President's Trophy, so I really don't see much drop off for the Avalanche this year, and they're going to be a force to be reckoned with again. So here's my projected point totals for the Central. As you can see, the Avalanche, Stars, Blues, and Wild are going to make the playoffs in my opinion. And I think that this is going to be another competitive division. I think the Jets will fall off, and Arizona and Chicago in the midst of a rebuild should still be more on the bad side. But I do think that Nashville, Minnesota, Dallas, St. Louis, and Colorado should all still be pretty decently competitive this year. And lastly, we're going over to the Pacific Division. I have finishing 8th in the Pacific Division the San Jose Sharks. The Sharks did some good things this offseason. They were able to offload most of the Burns contract to Carolina this year, which freed up some cap space. They did end up moving Aiden Hill to free up some of their cap space as well. They have goaltenders Kalkonen and Reimer in net, so I think their goaltending should be good this year. They have a younger blue line, so I do expect some hiccups this year, but I do think they could be decent enough. And in their forward group, they do have a couple of good forwards, especially some young guys like William Eklund and Thomas Bordeleau, who I think will both make the roster this year. So I think the Sharks should be around the same of what they were last year. I don't expect too much of improvement. I think getting guys like Eklund, Bordeleau in to the lineup should be their goal this year, and I do think that the Sharks will be a good team, but I can't see them making the playoffs. In 7th, we have the Anaheim Ducks. The Ducks were able to improve this offseason, in my opinion. They brought in guys like John Klingberg and Dmitry Kulyakov on the defensive side. They still have Gibson and Stolars in the goaltending position. They have brought in Strome and Vetrano on the offensive side. They have young talent like Ziegler and Terry, who really took off last year, and I think this team could be sneaky good. I don't think they'll make the playoffs this year, but I do see them being a competitive team, definitely not an easy win team to play against, and I think that they should be able to be a tough competitor for this regular season, but I can't see them making the playoffs. Over in 6th in the Pacific Division, I have the Seattle Kraken. Now, I think the Kraken will definitely take strides this year, and being my favorite team, I really did want them to make the playoffs, but I cannot see them upend any of these other Pacific Division teams. I think that they will finish not too far out of a playoff spot, but they will end up finishing out of a playoff spot. I think Beniers and Wright, as well as the addition of Burakovsky and Bjorkstrand, should help this offense a lot more. But their defense is still a little bit weak in my opinion, and not having Drieger as their backup is a bit of a letdown in my opinion. I think Jones and the Cord could be good backups, but they're not where Drieger was. So I do think that the defense could cost the Seattle Kraken a few points, and I think that they will wind up missing the playoffs. Over to 5th in the Pacific Division, I have the Vancouver Canucks finishing there. The Canucks did a lot to improve this team this offseason. They were able to keep JT Miller. They were able to bring in guys like Ilya Mikheyev, Andrei Kuzmenko, and I think that this team should be a lot more competitive than they were last year. But I do still have some questions about their defense, and I think that, well, they should be able to score their way through a couple of their games. I think when it comes to their defense, they could lose a few games due to that, and I think those few games will wind up them being out of the playoffs. Just like Nashville, those two should both be really close to a playoff spot. I cannot see the Canucks making the playoffs right now. In 4th, I have the Vegas Golden Knights. Now, I think the Knights did subtract a little bit this year, moving Pacioretty and Coughlin, not having Haig signed yet, Leonard being injured right now. But I do think they have enough talent on this team to make the playoffs. They missed by literally a hair last year, and I think that they were a really banged up team last year. They have a healthy Eichel. They have a healthy Mark Stone. The defense is still pretty good. If Logan Thompson and Aiden Hill can take strides this year to be good goalies and a good tandem, I have no reason why I think that the Golden Knights should not make the playoffs. I think they will just beat out Vancouver and Nashville by a hair, but I really do believe that the Vegas Golden Knights will be making the playoffs again this year. In 3rd in the division, I have the LA Kings. The Kings also finished 3rd in the division last year, so they were able to improve the offseason. They still have the same goalie duo. They have most of the same forward group, but a healthy Drew Doughty, which is going to be huge. If he can stay healthy throughout this year, this team should be better defensively. And they were able to add Kevin Fiala to this already good offense, as I think that the addition of Fiala and maybe Alex Turcotte making the team this year should improve their offense. A healthy Doughty should improve their defense, and I think they should be able to continue to be a top 3 team in the Pacific Division. I think it's pretty safe to say that the Kings probably improve this year. I'm not sure if they're able to oust one of the Alberta teams for a home playoff series, but I do think 3rd in the division is attainable for the LA Kings. Over in 2nd in the Pacific, it was really hard to me for pick between Calgary and Edmonton, who would finish 1st and 2nd, but I have the Flames finishing 2nd. Now, the Flames, start of the offseason was not too good. They had to move Matthew Tkachuk due to him wanting out, and Johnny Gaudreau left via free agency. But I do think that they were able to turn that script on its head. The additions of Jonathan Huberdeau and Nazem Kadri were huge to this team, and Mackenzie Weegar makes that defense a ton better. I think the addition of Weegar will literally make this Flames team a top 10 defensive team, and I think their offense should be pretty similar to what they were last year with the additions of Huberdeau and Kadri. So I think that the Flames should be able to challenge for top spot. I have them missing out on top spot in the Pacific by a hair, but I definitely think that the Flames should do pretty good this year in the regular season and once again have a home playoff date. And I have the Pacific Division crown going to the Edmonton Oilers. I think that the addition of Jack Campbell is really good for them. I think Campbell is really an underrated goalie. I think that Skinner should be a decent backup for the Oilers. Their defense is a little bit murky, and I do think it could be one of their weak points, but I do think that they should be able to overcome that weak point. When you have Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, you can outscore most of your opponents. And I think keeping Puljujarvi for now and Yamamoto and still having a decent bottom 6 should keep this Oilers offense lethal and one of the better offenses in the league this year. And I think that offense will skyrocket them to winning the Pacific Division. So here is the Pacific Division point total I have right now. So as you can see, I have the Oilers, Flames, Knights, and Kings making the playoffs this year. And I think that those 4 teams should make the playoffs. I think the Canucks, maybe the Kraken, should challenge for a playoff spot. But when it gets down to the last day of the season, I think these 4 teams should be the ones in the playoffs. So let me know what you think about this. How many would you disagree with? I think that this is some pretty good predictions. Would you have the Jets and Caps being more competitive this year? Would you have the Jackets, Sens maybe missing the playoffs still? I would like to know what you think and what your predictions are for this upcoming season. So that's all for today. Remember to like this video and subscribe. I do a blog, so I'll link that in the description below. And I can't wait to see you guys all for next week's video once the regular season has started. See you guys soon.